Throughout human history, people have tried to conquer the seas in various ways. Still, as nations developed along with their technologies and needs, they began to develop ships for special purposes, in terms of warships, of course, leading to the creation of some rather odd vessels, and one nation that certainly had their fair share of odd designs was the United Kingdom. The Royal Navy, due to the conflicts, possible conflicts, overall strength, material wealth, and of course, the necessity of the fleet to defend the Empire, they were able to create specialty ships for very specific purposes and some overall unique designs. In today's video, we'll be looking at a couple of their rather weird and wacky looking ships from the 20th century. The first vessel we are going to discuss is the interesting submarine X-1. Her origins derive from the First World War and just after as well, where Dr. Norman Friedman in his excellent book British Submarines in Two World Wars writes, in 1915, with a large submarine program underway, a submarine design committee was convened to decide future policy. The first meeting, September 8, 1915, considered 6 alternative types: 1 coastal, 2 patrol, 3 fleet submarine, 4 cruiser submarine, 5 mine layer, and 6 monitor. The first 2 already existed. The value of 3 would be gauged after the first of the K-class K3 trials. 2 E-boats were already being converted to mine layers. The Cruiser 4 was considered feasible, but it would have few targets. That cruiser submarine was an idea that the Royal Navy would continue to dabble with, and following the war, some thought it might be worthwhile experimenting with the concept, where Dr. Friedman continues, like other navies, the Royal Navy was much impressed by the large long-range cruiser submarines the Germans introduced late in the First World War. Grand Fleet C&C Admiral Beatty personally requested the D&C design one, and in a January 22, 1918 letter, he proposed construction that was impossible due to urgent wartime needs, but the idea resurfaced in December 1918. It made sense. A war against Japan would necessarily involve an attack on Japanese merchant shipping. Questions asked by the Post-War Questions Committee testified to continued interest. Initially, a British version of the wartime German cruiser using captured German engines seems to have been planned, but the project morphed. There was no question of ordering a prototype cruiser in 1919, not only because there was no money, but also because the board proposed at the Versailles Conference the British government should propose a ban on further submarine construction. The project came to life once that initiative had failed. Design work was underway by 1920. The Admiralty seems to have accepted the need for a big experimental submarine to test new technology. This role may explain the designation X-1 applied to the new submarine. Initially, the Admiralty didn't necessarily want to build submarines following the First World War, and none were included in the 5-year program, which was before the drastic cuts in the program due to the Washington Conference, which had not yet met. Anyway, the Director of Naval Construction already proposed sketches be prepared as a basis for future decisions, which interestingly enough, the power plant devised by the Germans in their U-139 class, a diesel-electric drive, the Admiralty initially planned to use those captured German diesels. Still, once it became clear that the cruiser submarine was seen as experimental, she became the testbed for the new Admiralty 3000 bhp diesels. German generator engines were still used, presumably because there was no EW Admiralty engine in that power range. Taking from Dr. Friedman again, in January 1921, RAs proposed beginning detailed design. It must soon have been clear that the experimental submarine would be the largest yet built. The initial sketch design seems to have called for a surface displacement of 2,300 tons. Undated detailed design data, probably compiled late in 1920, showed a surface displacement of 2,680 tons, which compared to the 2,130 tons for the largest late-war German U-cruisers, the abortive U-183 class, and 1,600 tons for the M class. Beam torpedo tubes were omitted because it was assumed that those in the bow tubes could be angled. The 3 4-inch guns would have been on individual turntables, and the submarine would have had a 9-foot rangefinder and a director control tower DCT. The upper part of the pressure hull plating would be strengthened as in the German U-cruisers, total thickness 1 inch. Initially, D&C planned to use 448 cells, a third more than in the largest British submarines, to obtain a submerged speed of 10 knots, but some wanted to cut back to 336 to simplify electrical arrangements, using larger cells. The Director of Gunnery Division, DGD, wanted 6-inch guns and spray shields. By March 1921, DGD had been argued back down to a twin experimental 5-inch gun, D&C asking that the diameter of trunk it required not exceed that necessary for a twin 4.7-inch, which had presumably been designed, although no such gun yet existed. D&O wanted a high-angle gun, but D&C considered it of little value, and it was never included in the designs. RAs feared that DGD was trying to turn the big submarine into a gunnery experiment, very secondary matter. He was willing to accept 5-inch guns. EOC and Vickers were asked for gun designs. The D&C, which was Eustace Tennyson Danecourt by the way, a fascinating figure, emphasized the need for submerged control, quick diving, and underwater endurance, and on top of that, habitability, as it would be vital for a submarine with such long range. There were further debates about her guns, and it was decided she should carry twin 5.2-inch mountings and gun controls, including a rangefinder and a director control tower. Because of all these revolutionary features, the submarine was to be called an experimental large submarine. Further changes were made to the design of the submarine, namely with the fuel tanks and the lines, to make sure she would have good underwater qualities and allow her to use her 6-bow torpedo tubes. Construction took much longer than the Admiralty thought. X-1 was laid down in November 1921 and commissioned in December 1925, successfully running power trials in March 1926. However, X-1 would have issues, and I think Dr. Friedman sums up her short and undistinguished career very well. She was then the largest submarine in the world. She was considered a good sea boat and handled well, surface and submerged. However, she suffered from crippling engine trouble due to torsional vibration. Her critical range of revolutions, RPM, was unfortunately near that required to make full speed. Once completed, she was sent to Gibraltar, but suffered serious engine trouble going out and returning. She was then returned to dockyard hands. She joined the Mediterranean Fleet in 1927 after a successful full-power trial, but she suffered further engine trouble after a near full-power trial in January 1928. Although she was repaired in Malta, she suffered further trouble on her passage home in April 1928. She also experienced trouble with her auxiliary engines and with her HP air compressors, after which she spent most of her time in dockyards. In 1933, the board decided that given her age and her limited operational value, she was no longer worth keeping active. In December of that year, she was placed under dockyard control. Her main impact on the British fleet at that point was that she accounted for an unusually large fraction of the total allowance submarine tonnage. Under the 1930 London Treaty, she could not be scrapped until she was over age. In 1936, she was deleted from the list and scrapped in 1937, the London Naval Treaty having lapsed by that time. X-1 was an interesting concept and overall ship. Her appearance is also really odd. Her twin 5.2-inch turrets are something you don't expect on a submarine, but then again, look at the M-class. Our next ship we are going to discuss is the battleship Iron Duke. Now, I know what you're thinking, how is the super dreadnought battleship that was the flagship for Admiral John Jellicoe an odd ship? Well, hold on, I'll get to it. But just as a brief background, Iron Duke entered service in March 1914, powerfully armed with 10 13.5-inch guns and twin turrets, machinery for a top speed of 21 knots, and a 12-inch main belt. She and her sisters were improvements on the preceding King George V class. In this, the class of battleships were some of the most powerful in the world when the First World War began, just a few short months after Iron Duke entered service, serving throughout the conflict, with a large portion spent as the flagship for Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Fleet, Admiral John Jellicoe. In that role, she led the Grand Fleet at Jutland, but once Beatty took command, he made Queen Elizabeth his flagship. Iron Duke continued to serve throughout the rest of the war and beyond. She served in the Mediterranean theater after the war, and even participated in the Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War and Greco-Turkish War. Interestingly enough, she was in Constantinople while the former German battlecruiser Goeben was lying in the city. Iron Duke continued to serve with the other battleships until the 1920s, when things were going to get weird for the battleship. Iron Duke was first sent to training duties in 1926. Considering her age, it only makes sense, as she and her sisters were amongst the oldest battleships retained after the Washington Naval Treaty. Then by 1929, the battleship was reduced to a gunnery training ship, where her story starts to get interesting, as in 1931, following the 1930 London Naval Treaty, her sisters Benbow and Marlborough were scrapped, and the Emperor of India was turned into a target ship for a time, while Iron Duke was chosen to be partially demilitarized, like USS Wyoming or IJ and Hiei. Iron Duke was partially disarmed, with the removal of B and Y turrets, parts of her armor, like the conning tower, and although none of her boilers were removed, some were mutilated to reduce her available power to 15,000 shaft horsepower. Now, smaller guns and rangefinders were fitted to the ship, and the question of those guns became a hotly debated topic, as some thought the ship should have twin 8-inch guns added, but that would have required a great deal of work. Instead, more 6-inch and 4.7-inch guns were fitted, which would change throughout the coming years. In this reduced role, Iron Duke saw out the 1930s, helping to train the sailors of the Royal Navy in the art of gunnery, even carrying out firing tests on her sister, the Emperor of India, in June 1931. As the Second World War was on the horizon in the spring of 1939, there were some calls to restore Iron Duke to her former glory, as the Royal Navy sought more capital ships, and with the Japanese Hiei having undergone such a conversion, it was thought plausible. Iron Duke was to receive revised armor and new guns, as the old 13.5-inch guns would have to be replaced, along with the secondary battery and the renewal of the machinery. This overhaul was going to be rather costly, and because that money could be devoted to more modern ships, it was eventually decided to not go through with it. Instead, Iron Duke was moored in Scapa Flow and served as a base ship or as an administrative ship for the base and the Orkney and Shetland Islands. Just a few days after Royal Oak was sunk in Scapa Flow, Iron Duke was also assaulted, as on October 17, 1939, Iron Duke was bombed, and to take from R.A. Burt and British battleships 1919 to 1945, Iron Duke was laying at sea buoy in about 10 fathoms of water when a power dive attack was made from 1,000 to 1,500 feet by 4 bombers at 10:33 a.m. One bomb, probably 500 pounds, which struck the water some distance out on the port bow, shook the ship, and threw mud and water to a considerable height. A second bomb fell some distance out on the port quarter. The major damage against sea boiler room appears to have been caused by 2 bombs, probably 500 pounds, which were not far out from the ship's side, near the turn of bilge before exploding some 1,000 feet in a direction slightly inclined to the fore and aft lines of the ship, traveling from the bow to the stern. A third bomb was observed to be released immediately after the 2 released simultaneously. The ship heeled to port, quickly reaching a maximum angle of probably 20 to 25 degrees and appeared to steady at that angle. Main deck scuttles were open, and these came awash when the ship heeled. Estimates of the time to reach this heel vary from 2 to 5 minutes. Iron Duke was not made to sustain such damage, and was beached to prevent her from sinking. This beaching did not save her from further attack, as on March 16, 1940, she received further damage from bombers. This damage was eventually repaired, though the ship remained beached in Scapa Flow for the remainder of the war. Unlike HMS Centurion, whom we have previously discussed, Iron Duke was not used as a block ship in the Normandy campaign. Instead, she survived the war, eventually being scrapped in 1946. Her story isn't as odd as some of the other ships in this video, and or her design. However, due to her London Naval Treaty refit, bomb damage, and her history in the First World War, I felt that Jellicoe's flagship's later career should be covered, and this series is the best way I can do it. Our final ship, we have HMS Furious. I know, I've already covered the large light cruisers, but Furious is just so weird that I can't help but cover her in more detail, as she's essentially a small battlecruiser armed with 18-inch guns, and then converted 3 times to become a flush-deck carrier eventually. As a refresher, the courageous class of battlecruisers, or large light cruisers as their creator, Admiral Jackie Fisher, would call them. Like the Monitors, these ships were created to assist in his Baltic project. It was one of several plans discussed by the Admiralty for using the Navy to break the deadlock of the armies on the continent. Other plans included landing troops on the Belgian coast and an assault on the Dardanelles. That preferred project of Churchill was eventually chosen to execute. There were other plans including seizing islands near the German coast to either observe the movements of the German fleet or a possible jumping-off point for an invasion of Schleswig-Holstein and the seizure of the Kiel Canal. That's all to say these plans were related to the Baltic project, as it gave the Grand Fleet access to the Baltic. But before it could transfer into the Baltic, the German High Seas Fleet would either have to be defeated or somehow prevented from entering the North Sea. Fisher saw these large light cruisers, or light battle cruisers, as a support vessel for his Baltic project, which here is an excerpt concerning the vessels from an interesting letter Fisher wrote to Sir Eustace Henry William Tennyson Danecourt, the Director of Naval Construction, in March of 1915, to which I am getting it from British Battlecruisers 1905 to 1920 by John Roberts. Fisher writes, "I've told the First Lord that the more I consider the qualities of your design of the big light battlecruisers, the more I am impressed by its exceeding excellence and simplicity. All the three vital requirements of gun power, speed, and draft of water so well balanced. Beardmore and Vickers, neither of whom was to build one of these ships, are sure they can produce 2 ships in 11 months, which alone is a testimony to the goodness of the design as regards simplicity. However, I fear we are not going to get even 2 out of the 4, owing to the parliamentary bugbear of delaying the last 4 ships of the Royal Sovereign type. It's a great pity, as it will be very greatly regretted." Now, the designation large light cruiser is an interesting one. As Fisher campaigned for more vessels, he described them as large light cruisers, but they would be better described as light battle cruisers, armed with 2 twin 15-inch gun turrets. The description of large light cruiser was employed to get cabinet and parliamentary approval because the construction of further battle cruisers and battleships had been vetoed. Still, the construction of light cruisers had not. Fisher also commented to Danecourt that these ships could be used against enemy cruisers that might reach the open seas to attack merchant ships, also describing the 18-inch gun Furious and how it would be used in his Baltic project, as well as possible 20-inch gun vessels for future projects, hoping that these large guns would be able to assist him in the invasion of Pomerania. Another interesting thing to note was the shallow draft. Where in R.A. Burt's British battleships of World War I, he describes the overall specifications Fisher wanted, writing, 1. Sufficient displacement to ensure maintenance of speed in moderate weather. 2. Draft restricted to allow operations in shallow waters at the entrance to the Baltic. Restriction of draft was to be approximately 5 feet 6 inches less than the average for a capital ship, and all other factors would be subordinated to this. 3. A powerful armament. 4. High speed, at least 32 knots to outsteam any enemy light cruiser. It was anticipated that the ship would be operating mainly in waters too shallow for heavy ships. 5. Protection to be on light cruiser standard, with 3 inch from the waterline to the forecastle deck. 6. Below water bulges for a considerable length amidships, and protected machinery and boilers kept as far inboard as possible and placed behind triple bulkheads. Anyway, Furious was going to differ from her half-sisters in some ways. One major way was her armament, designed to have 2 single 18-inch guns and turrets fore and aft, instead of the 2 twin 15-inch turrets. With that, her original particulars were as follows. She would displace 19,200 tons with machinery for 90,000 shaft horsepower and a top speed of 31.5 knots, and 2 18-inch guns with 1 and 1 turret forward and 1 aft, along with 8 later changed to 11 5.5-inch guns. 3 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, 5 Maxim machine guns, and 2 torpedo tubes. Her armor layout was similar to the Courageous class, differing in the main deck thickness, having a maximum thickness of 1.75 inches. Given the light construction of these ships, they had a fair number of issues. Like during Courageous's trials in 1916, she sustained structural damage while working up to full speed against a rough sea. Given their specialized nature, and with Fisher out of the picture as First Sea Lord in 1915, the Royal Navy had to figure out something to do with these ships. Courageous and Glorious had some prospects to work with the Grand Fleet, but Furious, on the other hand, she was way too specialized. Her 18-inch guns were very slow firing, and it was not practical for fleet work. Where I should say that her forward 18-inch gun was built but never fitted, as we will soon see. In February 1917, as the Royal Navy continued to experiment with aircraft at sea, the Grand Fleet Aircraft Committee recommended that the still being fitted out Furious would be of more use being completed as an aircraft carrier, since she would be able to embark a large number of aircraft and with her high speeds, be able to keep up with the battle fleet. Admiral David Beatty, now Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Fleet, who appointed this committee, gave some pushback saying that he wanted Furious to be complete to her original specifications. The committee felt that it was important to go through with this conversion as it would only remove her forward turret, and in its place, give her a forward flying-off platform. By July 4th, 1917, the ship was modified for this. With this partial conversion, Furious had a forward flying-off deck being 228 feet long and, depending on the part of the platform, 57 feet to 36 feet wide. The narrowest points were supported by steel girders, as the North Sea can be rather rough, and it was thought that they would support the deck. A hangar was built beneath the flight deck that would be able to carry about 10 aircraft. Those aircraft were lifted to the topside by lifts, and with some help from windbreakers, the aircraft were secured before takeoff on the topside. Initially, the aircraft could take off from Furious but could not land on her, with the pilots preferring to land in the water and be picked up later by boats and/or cranes. Using this forward flying-off platform, the Royal Navy began to experiment with Furious and began flying-off trials in late July 1917, where we turned to Squadron Commander Edward Harris Dunning, part of the Royal Navy Air Service. He's been described as a brave, skilled, and resourceful pilot. He had been conducting experimental carrier flights at the Deck Landing Trials Unit at the Royal Navy Experimental Air Station, Isle of Grain, near Sheerness in Kent. His commanding officer, Captain Wilmot Nicholson, gave his full support to the possibility of landing on the large takeoff deck of Furious, and that if he succeeded, he would prove that deck landings to be a practical solution instead of the so-called single shots that would be lost at the end of their sorties, increasing the potential of the air groups, and a demonstration would stimulate progress. The group consisted of Sopwith pups, an overall good aircraft. However, it seems it would have some difficulty with the landing process, where David Hobbs in British Aircraft Carriers, Design, Development, and Service Histories writes this: attempting to land a Sopwith pup in front of the superstructure of a large warship was all the more remarkable when the aircraft's controls are fully explained. It had a very low wing loading, and any turbulence would cause the pilot to have to make constant adjustments to the primary flying controls. The 80 horsepower 9-cylinder engine was a rotary engine in which the cylinders rotated with the propellers about a fixed crankshaft. The rotating mass gave considerable torque and made left-handed turns easier to achieve than right. Also, the nose tended to rise when turning left, and drop when turning right. The latter was never a good thing close to the surface of the sea, and the two effects made left-handed circuits the preferred option. They have remained so ever since. The engine operated over a very narrow range of revolutions, basically on or off, and its manipulation needed to be as much part of the pilot's handling skill as the flying controls. Coupled with the factors Mother Nature was going to throw at him, Dunning had his work cut out for him. On August 2nd, 1917, Furious sailed for a gun direction exercise near an island south of Scapa Flow. When she completed these, Dunning was going to demonstrate the first deck landing by a naval pilot in an operational aircraft on an operational warship underway at sea, where again Hobbs writes, he flew a low left-hand circuit off the ship's port side, controlling his height with the elevators and speed with ignition switch while constantly adjusting the mixture of control. Furious steamed at 26 knots into a steady 21-knot wind, giving a wind over the deck of 47 knots from directly ahead. This was slightly higher than ideal, and meant that he would have to overtake the deck as he drew alongside, turning in close ahead of the port derrick and encountering cliff edge effect, as the wind was blowing upwards against the ship's side. Once over the center of the deck, Dunning would have centralized the controls and held the pup N6453 in a 3-point attitude about 10 feet over the deck, flipping the engine on and off to descend. He touched down at 11:10 on the hangar roof, at the widest part of the deck, and was held firmly in place by officers briefed to prevent the pup being blown over the side when it was lightened when he got out. The importance was widely recognized, and with several Grand Fleet senior officers aboard, it marked a true watershed moment for naval aviation. Unfortunately for Dunning, his success and luck came to an end on the 7th, just 5 short days later, When he attempted another landing and the aircraft was blown over the side, and with no crash boat in the water, it took Furious 20 minutes to get back to the position where the plane had gone over, and it was found that Dunning had been knocked unconscious due to the crash and unfortunately drowned. Dunning's demonstration led to recommendations from the C&C of the Grand Fleet that the aft 18-inch gun be removed and be replaced by a second flight deck intended for aircraft recoveries. The pilots who had flown on Furious opposed this change for several reasons. One of the major ones being the fear of turbulence after the bridge structure and funnel would make the approach from the rear dangerous, not to mention the hot gases from the funnel. Still, the Admiralty went through with their design changes, and an after-flight deck was fit with gangways being fit on each side of the funnel and superstructure to connect the landing and flying off decks. The aircraft complement increased by more than double. This conversion was complete by March 1918. In this refit, an arrestor gear was fit to the after landing deck, which was comprised of longitudinal steel hawsers stretched tight, ending at a ramp at the forward end of the flight deck. The Sopwith pups were fitted with skids instead of wheels with hooks on each side to catch the wires to prevent the aircraft from going over the side of the ship. A net was placed at the rear end of the funnel to prevent aircraft from flying into it, being replaced by vertical ropes. Landings were not easy as the superstructure and funnels were retained, with eddies occurring because of them. Also, those hot gases coming from the funnels. Few successful landings would occur with this hazardous setup, with most pilots choosing to land in the water to be picked up later by a crane rather than attempting to land on the deck, making Furious a takeoff-only aircraft carrier for the time being. In July of 1918, still serving as a flying-off platform, Furious became the first carrier to successfully deliver an air attack from a carrier on land-based targets when she launched 7 planes, which attacked Zeppelin sheds at Tondern. After the war, her future was somewhat in doubt, as she was laid up. The 2 flight deck arrangement with a central bridge and funnel had been a failure, but it was proposed that she be converted into a flush-deck aircraft carrier and not keep her interesting configuration. So, in 1921, the director of naval construction, Eustace Tennyson Danecourt, decided to go through with the conversion. The conversion had called for the ship to be cleared down to the present hangar, and in its place, 2 large hangars would be built, one on top of the other. The lower hangar was an odd shape, containing workshops and offices. It was between 35 and 50 feet in width, and about 550 feet in length, while the upper hangar was 50 feet in width and 520 feet in length. Furious was supposed to be able to carry 60 aircraft, but in reality, she would carry no more than 36 at a time. 2 lifts served these hangars. These 2 lifts served multiple flying-off points on the decks with a length of about 340 feet. In the process, the funnel, superstructure, and mast were removed, and she was given a clear flight deck through most of the forward section, sloped slightly upward to help slow down the aircraft. The nose of the upper flight deck was rounded off as experiments showed that it provided better aerodynamic conditions. The original flying-off platform was retained as another takeoff platform and was intended for small fighters to be flown off from this lower deck. Safety nets would be provided on each side, and palisades, or more simply put, barricades were added on to do the same job. Cranes were provided on the ship's rear so the ship could work with seaplanes. The considerable rise in freeboard caused concerns about the new height of the new hangars, with those in favor of it arguing that it would impact the design of new planes, as they would need to be smaller to fit the hangars. With that, the hangar size was a compromise. The higher freeboard exposed the ship to more wind surface, necessitating Furious to have heavier anchors and cables than would be required for a vessel of such size. Armor did not change much besides the addition of the 5/8-inch thick flight deck and underwater bulges similar to those found on Royal Oak. The navigation arrangements were fit to the fore end of the upper hangar, being duplicated on either side of the vessel, with a gangway connecting them. On the starboard side was the compass platform, where the captain and his designated officers commanded the ship. On the port side was the flying control position, where air operations were directed. Like Argus, she was fitted with a retractable chart house in the center of the flight deck. The armament was to consist of 5.5-inch guns, including 6 high-angle guns, as well as 3-pounders and machine guns. The machinery spaces remained where they were, but required new horizontal arrangements for the discharge of gases aft. This reconstruction took place between June 1921 and September 1925. As of 1925, she had a normal displacement of 22,500 tons, and her machinery remained the same, except for the refitting of equipment in 1931, where it remained generally the same, just newer. As of 1925 in her sea trials, she had the machinery for 90,600 shaft horsepower for a speed of 30 knots. Her armor arrangement was a main belt of 2 inches, bulkheads of between 2 and 3 inches, a protective deck of between a quarter inch and an inch, and a flight deck of 5/8 of an inch. Her armament as of 1925 was as previously mentioned, but in 1939 she was refit to have 12 4-inch high-angle guns, 4 pom-poms, 2 half-inch machine gun mountings, 4 3-pounders, and 4 machine guns. Although it was hoped that she'd be able to carry up to 60 aircraft at a time, in reality it was more like 36, obviously depending on the period, as she would serve in various roles requiring different aircraft complements. In August and September 1925, she carried out her sea trials as an aircraft carrier. During these trials, smoke was ejected through the side openings, and the effect on the quarterdeck and hangars was very bad. This was solved in the hangar at least through the use of the fire curtain, with other operations being carried out smoothly, like the testing of hangar equipment. Earlier in the year, she carried out several flying-off trials with many different aircraft. The conclusions drawn from these trials showed that Furious would be a very capable platform for takeoff and landing operations. Throughout the interwar period, Furious carried several different aircraft combinations. One aircraft she carried often in her later career was the Fairey Swordfish. Throughout the 1920s, she carried different flight complements in her various stations with the Atlantic Fleet, undergoing a refit in Devonport mostly for her machinery that would last until February of 1932. After her machinery was worked up, she went on for a cruise with the Mediterranean Fleet. Like I mentioned, her air groups changed pretty frequently. For example, in 1933, Furious's air groups consisted of the 801st, 811th, and 822nd groups, where they flew Fairey Flycatchers, Hawker Nimrods, Hawker Ospreys, Blackburn Ripons, and Fairey 3Fs. She rejoined the ex-Atlantic Fleet and now Home Fleet in May of 1934, where she briefly joined the Mediterranean Fleet in October and then back to the Home Fleet. Between those years and the Second World War, she served as a training carrier and had some refits, notably in 1939 with the changing of her armament. With these new armaments, her forward flying-off platform would no longer be used, and the addition of a short island superstructure with an RDF aerial pole and high-angle director on the starboard side flying off deck. When the Second World War broke out in September of 1939, she was based out of Rosyth, spending the first several months of the war escorting convoys to and from Halifax. During this time period, she carried a group of skuas and swordfish, where the swordfish made an attack run against a U-boat on September 22nd. Courageous attempted the same thing 5 days earlier as part of First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill's hunter-killer groups, in which she was sunk in the process of hunting submarines. In December, she sailed to and from Halifax to escort the first Canadian soldiers to Europe. Then in April 1940, after a short refit period, she operated in the Norwegian campaign, with her aircraft attacking German ships, even taking part in the Second Battle of Narvik. After operations in Norway, at the end of June, she carried gold across the Atlantic and returned with American aircraft. In the intervening time, her other half-sister, Glorious, had been sunk by the 2 German battleships of the Scharnhorst class. She returned to help in the Norwegian campaign, where her aircraft struck coastal targets in Norway before carrying out Operation Stripe, where she ferried aircraft several times to West Africa between November and January of 1941. She was attacked by bombers but would not sustain any serious damage. Then she spent the next several months taking aircraft to Gibraltar and on to Malta. She also carried out anti-shipping operations in August of 1941 and later went on to the USA for a refit. Seeing how her wartime service consisted of ferrying aircraft over long distances, her machinery was getting quite strained. Upon arrival in the United States in October 1941, she was refitted, and when that was completed, she was sent on to Clyde in the United Kingdom for more upgrades. New British equipment and the like, also upgrades to her light anti-aircraft battery. Her first mission after being refit was another ferrying operation to Malta in August 1942, Operation Pedestal, doing this a couple more times before assisting in the landings for Operation Torch, where her aircraft successfully struck Vichy French aircraft still on the ground in their hangars, retiring to Gibraltar only after about a day because her assistance wasn't necessary. She joined Force H and continued her operations on the African coast until February 1943, spending a short maintenance period, and then took part in several anti-shipping operations with the Home Fleet, and attacking German positions in Norway to distract from the Allied invasion of Sicily. Another notable operation is her aircraft attacking German shipping in the Norwegian fjords on June 1st, 1944. She and Victorious helped to sink 2 large merchant vessels. This was followed up by an attack on Tirpitz on July 17th, where smoke screens obscured the target and prevented good bombing. But with ample warning, the Germans were able to deploy smoke screens. She then took part in mining operations off of Norway until September of 1944, when she was paid off and joined the Reserve Fleet in April of 1945. Following the war, she was used for several things, including target practice, eventually being scrapped in 1954. There are so many weird and wacky ships out there, especially for the Royal Navy. This is a fun series that I definitely intend on continuing. Hopefully you all enjoy it too. I know I didn't cover every odd ship or boat the Royal Navy had constructed, or other nations for that matter. If you have any ship in particular you would like me to cover in the future, please put it in the comments. I plan on continuing the series, so the more you put, the more ideas for the future. Anyway, thanks for watching everyone. I hope you all enjoyed it. Please remember to like and subscribe as it will help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great day.